Hello. Hi. Good morning, good evening, everyone.
Good morning, good evening, and good night.
Okay, it's already 9:05 and we have many topics on the list. So let's get started. Hopefully we can get as many as we can. So first we have several topics carry over from the last sync. And the first on the list is the idempotency key topic, which last time we covered. We have some discussion, but we went over time about the UUID's version discussion. So Huaxin, I will leave to you to continue that.
Oh yeah, I just want to take a quick 5 minutes to continue this idempotency key discussion. So last time we talked about mandating UUID v7, but we also agreed that server shouldn't rely on the timestamp inside the UUID to make important decision. After seeing more feedback in the discussion thread and the PR, I'm wondering maybe we could leave the UUID version flexible so the spec stays simple and then the implementation can make the decision. So what do you guys think?
What's the purpose of using a flexible version? In general, I like for specs to be specific and not have a lot of like flexibility in ways that that doesn't really like add value. So like what's the value of being able to use a UID v4 versus a UID v7?
The thing is that when I drafting the spec, I will say it's mandating UID v7, but people want me to be more specific and also say the server cannot make important decision based on the timestamp inside the UUID. V7. So I kind of feel it's a bit awkward to write this way because it's kind of, I kind of feel it's kind of defeating the purpose. We want the UID V7, but we don't allow the server to use the timestamp inside it. So I feel kind of a bit awkward in my writing.
I would agree that that's like spec overreach, right? Servers can do what they choose to. We should be clear that the purpose of the UID is to identify and be a opaque token. You know, the choice of UID v7 is for debuggability and things like that, because it gives you some idea of what the timestamp was on the client for when the service received the timestamp. But I don't think that we need to specifically disallow those behaviors. Yufei, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I put some comments on these emails, right? Basically, what I see about idempotency ID, the main purpose of that is for uniqueness of cross clients, like sometimes even just within one client, and the server can decide what to do. So the only requirement for that ID is uniqueness. I agree that V7 have some benefits like timestamps, which is useful for debug, and server, as we said, server still cannot use that because server have to use the server side time to decide when to expel these idempotency ID. Overall, I think it's kind of overall specification for UID v7. Like the only requirement necessity of this ID is the uniqueness, which also like seems like along the industry or like AWS EC2 implementation as well, Stripe clients implementation, they have a very similar concept of the idempotency key, which only require the uniqueness of the key. So if we say this is V7, it's fine, like it's not a big deal, but still it's kind of a overall specification to one particular version of UUID.
I mean, to me, it seems useful to have a UUID where you can get some form of the client's time for debugging purposes. I mean, if we're considering using like, I would have been fine, I think, if this were like, hey, you should just use UID v4, right? Like, I don't think that would have been a problem. But because we're considering the utility and value of UID v7, and we see that there is value, why not just use that, right? So, I mean, either we want that value or we don't. It sounds like the value is there. So to me, saying, hey, you can use UID v4 is recognizing that UID v7 is slightly better for debuggability, and then saying, yeah, but you don't have to do it. And that's where I just go like, why recognize that something is better and not just say use UID v7? I mean, truly, like, actually, point number one here is we're overthinking this. Let's just choose one. But the other is like, if we think there's value in UID v7, make it UID v7. Dennis?
Yeah, I think part of something that relates to what you said earlier about servers choosing, what kind of functionality. I think part of my hesitation about going ahead with the UID v7 is precisely because now, like, I think folks have been hinting about wanting to incorporate that timestamp portion as part of the behavioral, like the critical behavioral functionality of the times of the idempotency key expiration.
Why do we need to disallow that, though?
Right, exactly. And I think that is the crux.
Is there a correctness problem if people find uses for that timestamp? I mean, that's where I think we're overreaching, is that if, like, we should say how this thing works, right? Like, what information you get as a service from this thing. Yeah. And then it is up to implementations how they implement it. And you're never going to be able to like police this either. Right. It's like, hey, we're gonna, base something in our back end on the timestamp from U@7.
Yeah, and I think this is the purpose of a spec, is to allow backends to cooperate on having the same behavior, right? So I think this is exactly one of the cases where it's certainly possible to allow de facto standards behaviors to arise unspecified, right? And maybe some group of service providers will decide to start adhering to one de facto standard and another will not. And in this case, the decision of how to handle the key relative to the timestamp inside of it will lead to correctness differences when clients try to move from one server to another. And the point of the spec, it seems to me, is to allow this idea of portability, where a client can expect the same, at least for critical behavior, right? It's always a fuzzy line. Like some servers will behave differently than others, no matter what, in some ways. Like some will respond slower, some will.
If one service finds a clever way to use this, and like, what is the risk here to other services?
The risk is that a client switching from one service to another will suddenly experience something unexpected that could lead them to have correctness mistakes, right? So during a migration, they would say, now my
mistakes are the responsibility of a service, right? If you have correctness mistakes in your service, that is on your service. We need to make sure that correctness is something that you can achieve with this. But like a correctness bug in a service, like there could be any number of correctness bugs.
Right. So in this case, the example would be if one service which does decide to use the timestamp for the rejection, and allow, like, a client is configured with a proxy that has up to, let's say, 5 minutes. For whatever reason, their boundary is just right for this server that rejects that used the timestamps to reject older ones. So they didn't have to think about whether they were accidentally reusing older idempotency keys. Now they switch to a new server, right? And the new server, but the spec did not mandate for the new server to also do this behavior. So what I'm saying, though, is like it should be specified. And if we want that information to be allowed, then it needs to be advertised in some way in the spec, like either in a separate field would be my preference. If we want to use the V7, though, like,
I don't think anyone is planning on using this for correctness or those pieces. I think you made a strong case last week, the last time, that a timestamp, if we want it to be accessible to decisions, should be part of what you send to the service. I don't think anyone is questioning that.
Okay.
The real issue here is, do we want to be able to rely on this being a U@V7, or do we want it to just be opaque? Like, I mean, honestly, choose one. Like,
and I think if we document at least that servers are not expected to, right? Like, I think
like we just need a clear path forward. Doing something like saying, hey, we prefer V7, but it can be anything, is worse than just saying it must be V7 or it must be opaque. And then our implementation puts a UID of whatever flavor.
I would suggest, like, we can say it must be you. I agree with, okay, we should pick one. If we pick either one that we pick, I think we should add something that says, like, the server should not base behavioral decisions on the content. The same way, like, so
we don't want extra rules about what the service can and can't do based on information it has, right? Like, why would we do that? It's not going to affect your ability to talk to different services. And I think that even the use case that you were talking about, where I have a proxy that delays requests until just about the right amount of time, like, we could easily construct situations in which the services are not limited and you have the exact same behavior, because the timeout for these things and the grace period around the timeout is entirely a server-side decision. like we can construct cases where services make decisions about implementing this feature, and independent of the protocol, you get these minor behavior differences. But let's keep in mind, we're talking about when there are external failures and recovering from things like timeouts and other network glitches. So like, even if you did have something where you move from service A to service B and all of your idempotency keys fail, like that's really just a matter of like occasional, occasional incremental failures.
Yeah.
And that's not that big of a problem.
I mean, so like the one clear test case one could have is, are you allowed to construct a UID v7 with UTC timestamp 0, right? Like that is behavior. So what if during debugging you're like, I don't really care, and I don't want to use a current timestamp. I just want a hard-coded one. Can you use, like, is that a valid test case?
Yeah, sure. Like as long as it's a UID v7. Now, granted,
Nice.
what you're sending is a little weird,
yeah,
right? And you're reducing the uniqueness of what you're sending based on, hard coding that timestamp. But really, like we don't care all that much, and that would provide value because when you go and look at the timestamp of that UID, someone looking at these sessions would go, "Huh, the timestamp from this UID is 0. There's something up with that client." But like we said, I think that we're overthinking this and we just need to choose one. I would choose UID v7 and just say it should always be a UID v7, because that is clear and it creates something that services can use, or logs can be used for debugging. But truly, like, I don't know why I'm defending this position so strongly. Just choose one. Let's get it done.
The only thing I would add to this conversation is that I think any unique identifier works for idempotency. I think that like putting in the spec that any unique identifier similar to what the strike doc does is more allows more people to participate to have this feature. Setting UID v7 is an extra restriction that clients and servers now have to participate, have to like implement in order to participate. So that's the only downside of specifying UID v7, is to say, you have to be using this in order to participate in the spec for idempotency. But again, similar sentiment. I think like any works.
I will sign up for creating PRs against any client that doesn't support UID v7 to make it happen.
We have this recorded, so they're going to come back to you.
At any point in the future, if we choose UID v7, people can ping me on Slack or send me an email, and I will go open a PR to add UID v7 support to your client.
Ryan Blue is solely responsible for UID implementations across the world.
I mean, truly, like, if it's v4, it's v4. I don't care. But I don't think that UID v7 is such a high hurdle that it's going to prevent people from writing clients.
Palette. Oh, we can't hear you.
You're muted.
You're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Now you're muted. Now you're unmuted. Nope.
I'll go ahead and you can work on your audio since I'm next. So the one scenario where, and my advocacy for v7 support is really in light of what Ryan was saying about debuggability, because one of the concerns that I have about this protocol, and I kind of raised early on, was you actually, other than like the server retention of whatever this ID is and its ability to track the IDs, you actually don't know when that goes out of window and when a request will be made that's far outside of whatever your server-side retention window is. And once it goes out of that window, you actually don't know if the client is retrying or trying for the first time. Having a V7 where we say, hey, this V7 should be generated at the time of the first request, which we should include in terms of the spec, at least I can log that information and I've got the ID. And then if I can see like the request time and the processing time from a debuggability perspective, that's much easier to understand like what sequence of things potentially happened there. It isn't necessarily a, hey, I want to block this thing based on the time, but it is a signal that you received a request that's outside of the window. That could be because of client clock skew, that could be other reasons, but it is additional information that you can use. And like the burden to supporting V7 is so low that it is kind of questionable. Like this is an issue, other than if you have some strong aversion to what a catalog may do with any request. And I think we're kind of over specifying if we get to the point where we're saying, hey, you can't do these specific things because we chose this specific representation. Stephen.
Yeah, that's actually my question, tied to what Daniel was saying earlier. If we say we're going to use V7, and maybe it can lead to some server implementation to rely on this timestamp. I think that's what Daniel's point. Hey, should we specify, hey, if we use V7, should we specify in the spec that the server should not depend on timestamp for, let's say, expired keys and those kind of correctness behavior? Should we clarify those? Even say we choose to use V7. So we don't want different server to have different implementation that may affect the correctness or may affect the behavior.
I'm concerned about trying to overly burden implementations with requirements about how they must behave when it's not really necessary. The client, we definitely want, because we are providing the reference implementation for the client, like we want to provide guidance about like, well, if we're using a UID v7, then generate it at the time of request. Don't use some just like arbitrary point or something like that. And this is largely for the choice of v7. If that doesn't matter, if we don't want any of that, just don't specify it at all. Just say it's an opaque thing and we'll provide a UID in the Java implementation, right? So we have like two opposite ends of the spectrum. Anything in between gets confusing and there's nuance, and then you're trying to address the nuance by putting requirements on the client or the server, and that just overcomplicates everything about this.
Hello.
Okay, this time, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Nice. I just want to emphasize one thing. Dennis is also mentioned that I believe opaque is not the good solution. We should be specify on the spec like which kind of UUID we are going to use. That then between the switching to services, it will not break that. Like if I'm using the Polaris and if it is using UUID 4, then another one is using UUID 7. I should be able to switch that, and it should not be affect anything else. We should be clear for UUID. I agree with that. UUID 7 is most efficient. I just look at that on the internet, and also more wide range. There is no collision compared with the UUID 4. That's all.
Then you're muted.
Yeah, so thanks. One last point, because maybe this is a bit of a meta point, because I'm hearing like maybe a discrepancy in expectations about what the goal of this spec, whether it's in more client facing or server facing or both, right? Because I see it as both, and like a point on restricting, like the goal of the spec is to restrict, not only define things that a server should do, but also some of the things that a server should not do for consistency, right? Like it's putting constraints on ourselves for the good of the broader ecosystem. And like some analogies that I see an analogy where, like, for example, in the hardware space, sometimes USB chargers, which are not spec compliant, maybe believe that they have an interpretive license to use information such as, they'll detect if a wire is made out of copper somehow, or like they have heuristics, and they'll incorrectly advertise that, hey, we're going to use this information and allow fast charge even when it's not in the spec. And then there's a whole I forget, this is a little bit far-fetched perhaps, but there's a whole YouTube series about like somebody who's like all about the consumer electronics specs and shows how these things all catch fire when they're incorrectly interpreted by the receiver, right? And this is where like things that decorate behaviors based on things that are unspecified, when there was an opportunity to have it in the spec, can lead to unexpected behaviors, right? And this is and another piece of this is like, as a thought experiment, I think I mentioned this in the thread, like suppose it was v4 UUID. Would we feel comfortable with a server basing behavioral decisions on the MAC address portion of the UUID, right? And why? And if not, then why is that different than?
So we already allow this, user agent string, other properties that are defined, like a catalog implementation can provide a different result for a Iceberg version that is sent to the catalog than another Iceberg version that's sent to a catalog. It can use user agent to adapt issues that have been found with a particular client or implementation. So we already allow the catalog a lot of freedom to manage requests.
But that's a shortcoming of the spec, right? And we don't necessarily need to perpetuate it.
Okay, so the purpose of the spec, since it was asked, is to maximize compatibility between clients and services, right?
Yeah.
So like that, I think, is a good lens through which to look at this problem. So we're trying to maximize compatibility. Now you're right, we do not currently have restrictions that say you can't use the MAC address portion of an IP of a UAD4. Should we? I would say no, because whatever decisions the service chooses to make, including decisions on the MAC address portion of a current UID, could well be stupid, right? Like it could be that like I don't allow requests from devices using a Broadcom NIC or something like that, right? Like that would be dumb, but we don't need to disallow it, because everything that we disallow like that makes the spec harder to implement and restricts us in ways that honestly might be eventually valid, right? I'm not going to say like I can come up with a use case where you'd want to like ban a certain type of NIC, but we don't know what the valid use cases are. And I don't think that there is a compelling interest here in like saying that you can't use this. I also don't think that people should use this, right? But I would definitely not specify that you can't do it, just like I would not specify you can't use any information from a unit before. What we want is to make sure that the debuggability capability, that is our primary concern here, is available all the time, rather than saying like, oh, hey, what if someone, misuses this information? If you misuse information, that's fine. Like there are a million ways to misuse other pieces of information in this spec that we don't disallow.
We got to take this offline. Like we spent half our time today on this one topic, and we've got a lot of other like more important things to discuss.
We do.
So let's take it to the dev list or take it offline. Washington, maybe, if you want to reach out to people and see if we can come to some sort of consensus on what approach we want to use.
I mean, if we can't agree, let's just say it's opaque and it's an it's a UID4, because like it is not worth delaying this to. Does anyone think it's worth delaying to build consensus here?
We can always modify the spec later on too. It's not like a one and done thing. So.
Adding restrictions is not a good thing, right? Because that could be disallowing this. You could use another key to say like, hey, this is a UID v7, but at that point, we can just detect whether it's a UID v7, right? Like the whole downside of the use whatever you want is that you have an if statement that says, hey, if this is a UID v7, grab the timestamp and log it. So like it truly does not matter.
Okay.
At least, are we agree with the? Is there any objections about the Unity, the UID 7? Like we don't need to say that, but by default can we use the UID 7?
That's the current spec, like prefer UID 7.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the whole point of this contention. Is by UUID v7, then people are questioning what can you use the timestamp for? What do we need to put into the spec? It's overcomplicating things. So either we just need to be okay and just saying it's UUID v7, or we say it's opaque. What's going to unblock us here?
Let's take it offline.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do that. I'm gonna move us forward. Next one, case insensitive IRC catalog to reconcile multi-engine platform use case.
So this is from me. It's more like an open discussion on this interesting case sensitivity issue. So now we're kind of in a world while in the data lake world we have multiple engines. We have that are working with the same catalog implementation. And in our REST catalog spec, we remain unopinionated about the casing of the identifier. We didn't regulate whether any characters are not allowed, whether it's lowercase, uppercase. So it's all up to the catalog implementation. Now we see like in the proprietary world, we have both case-sensitive catalog, such as Polaris, Graptino. We have case-insensitive catalog, which lowercase things such as Glue and Unity. Now, the interesting thing will happen when multiple engine, especially case-sensitive engine and case-insensitive engine, both talk to the same case-sensitive catalog. For example, Polaris. Now, I've listed an example scenario where you can use a Spark to create a mixed case table name, and then you will find it hard to find that table in Trino if you do not config some other special settings, as pointed out by the UI in the doc. So there are like kind of two general direction now to kind of mitigate the problem. So the first is from the engine side. For example, like Trino provides a case-insensitive name matching option, so that you could kind of bypass this problem despite the engine itself decide to lowercase every identifier when it's normalized user input. But this will still not solve the problem if you have names differ only in case, then that will result in an ambiguity error in Trino. Now the other direction would be just as those case insensitive catalog to just so on the catalog side, we choose to normalize all the identifier to lowercase, for example, then that will solve like kind of all the problems. But then the limitation will be that so the catalog will take the responsibility to of the opinion of all the casing that's stored in the meta store. Now, I think I would like to first just hear others' opinions, like how do you like solve this problem in your use case. And the second is that whether we consider it's valuable to add some standardization in our spec regarding this casing issue. For example, as pointed out by Yufei in another dev list thread, probably just add a config property key that the server could have a standardized way to tell the client whether I'm case sensitive or insensitive, would help let the client decide more efficiently. Yeah, Christian, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go ahead and briefly tell how we do this with Lakekeeper, because I don't think lowercasing everything on the catalog side is a good thing unless you have a second column basically where you store the proper case, because in higher layers of a lakehouse, you need to store the proper case. People might want to use like human readable nice names for tables, so the catalog needs to store those. With Lakekeeper, we are case insensitive, and we're just using a collation, which is case insensitive to, well, if someone gives us a string, we use a case insensitive collation to check if the table exists. If the table exists and the response includes the name, then we give the client back the name that it requested. If the response, for example, if you list all tables in a namespace, we always give back the proper name that is stored in the database. And then whatever the client does, we are pretty much compatible with that. Yeah, so just saying that for us, this currently isn't an issue because we solved it on the catalog side, but I'm also fine with standardizing it somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, but just quick to be clear, I'm not saying like we are going to standardizing like the case insensitive, meaning the lowercasing everything, but I just would like to, for example, for Lakekeeper, we can convey to the client that you are a case insensitive one. That means you cannot create two names that only differ by cases. What I assume in the Lakekeeper implementation.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right.
So I want to make sure that we don't do, I think, inappropriate things on the client side here. So I think it would be inappropriate and a bad idea in general for the Iceberg client to modify any of the data that it is handed. So, for example, if say we introduced some configuration property that says, you know what, this is a case insensitive catalog. Okay, like it's not that the client should then lowercase everything, right? Christian gives a great example of why you would want to send exactly what was passed into the client to the service so that it can keep track of both you know, the case insensitive index and the case sensitive name that was provided. So I don't think that there is any client behavior that would change based on this. Now, I think that the only thing that I would change or potentially change is passing this through to communicate to the engine itself whether the engine needs to pass case sensitive or case insensitive strings into the client. However, what is the justification for having a case insensitive mode where you discard information before handing it to the catalog? Just like I wouldn't say that's a great idea for the client, I also don't think that's a great idea for the service. So for Trino, like I would just say that this option should always be on. And I wouldn't like overcomplicate the REST spec by adding something to allow you know, bad defaults on the parts of engines, which I get might be a controversial take. But to me, like the engine should pass through what it gets. Then the service is in the end in charge of making decisions about how it identifies tables. And that doesn't require any adaptation on the part of the Iceberg client or even passing information through. And I think the best practice.
I just want to second what Christian said, and I think that a lot of this is about letting the catalog handle cases that make sense for it. Like obviously the way that he presented it, like they're trying to address the incompatibilities. I assume, you know, because you're using a collation, you don't allow collisions within that, you know, that namespace. But we also want to be open to the existing implementations that are out there and not overly complicate this, because, you know, if like Hive Metastore added a REST interface, which it may or may have not, I actually don't know, it's probably not going to change fundamentally how Hive works. So we don't want to put too many restrictions on how catalogs need to behave in a space where it's actually very messy. And what we don't want is a race to the bottom in terms of like compatibility, where we all just end up with lowercase again, and no special characters or anything like that in names, because we're trying to force too much compatibility. And we also don't want to overcomplicate again, like what people need to do to build a REST catalog that can accurately load and store data for anything that operates with that catalog. So I think that for robust implementations, it's easy for them to handle it in the way that Christian described, right? Engines may or may not be able to handle special casing at both a table level, at a column level. We allow things even in the table representation that a lot of engines can't represent, like special characters within names, right? And so we don't have compatibility modes and things like that we're going to use and then have like catalogs swapping column name characters or other things in order to provide compatibility. So I think this is an area where we should probably just leave it loose and let implementations drive the behavior, right? Ultimately, I'd love to see all the engines get to a point where they can express more, but they can't.
Belinda?
Yeah, so plus one on to the point that we should not add anything into the spec. Although, like in terms of what already exists today, we already have some examples of catalog, let's say Glue or HMS, that are using lowercase. As an engine, if we think from that perspective, if you are an NC compatible engine, you are defaulting to uppercase. But then the catalog can implicitly lowercase. What happens is like you might create things on your side that are uppercase, but the server on its side, the catalog, it's lowercasing it, which creates kind of this mismatch. So that's where like if the catalog can say, okay, I'm gonna implicitly do a conversion, then let the engine know somehow as a config or whatever. So then the engines know that this catalog supports identifiers only in a certain casing. Then it will make sure that it represents those identifiers in the same way as the catalog. And it only allows maybe lowercase identifiers to be sent to the catalog so that it's not the conversion does not happen only on the server side, and now we have a mismatch after the commit.
So I just want to pass on Melinda's point, and also want to extend that a little bit. So the initial the additional config field I propose is not aimed to let the client do something different. Well, it's more or less just let it be aware that it's talking to maybe a case insensitive. So it could, for example, on the Trino side, it could throw some warning that probably, hey, recommend you to turn this option on, or otherwise you will see unexpected behavior. For example, you will not be able to find some identifier with all uppercase, or maybe in some when Spark talk to case. When Spark talk to Glue, it will expect that it create a table with decal writing in all uppercase, then it will receive a table in all lowercase. This kind of unexpected behavior could be warned at an earlier level. That's yeah. So that's a short-term point for this config. Now, kind of in the long term, we could then kind of discuss whether we want to have some more coded versus uncoded in version 2 spec, but I think that will be too far from this point.
So I'm actually more and more, as the discussion has gone on, against the idea of trying to plumb through the case sensitivity and rules of the catalog to the client. I think there's a fair point that you don't want to take what the user types in, uppercase it, and then lowercase it, right? That doesn't make any sense. That is probably a great argument against modifying anything at the engine level before sending that to the service, which is in the end the source of truth for what names are identical or equivalent, right? But also like pushing that information and saying, hey, rather than uppercasing stuff, lowercase stuff, that creates two problems. The first problem is fairly minor. It is that, you know, I could come up with a casing strategy that is the first letter lowercase, the second letter uppercase, and so on for even and odd letters, which would be totally stupid. But like, you know what, are we going to start exchanging these silly things? Probably not. So like, why do we need to expand the spec at all? The second thing is that even if we agree on like, you've got preserve case, lowercase, and uppercase, really the best practice is preserve case. And engines are going to have to change in order to fix any of these things anyway. So like, let's just say everyone preserve case and send it through. That also avoids bugs like the Turkish locale problem that, you know, is infamous here. Like, do we want to rely on all clients having fixed or avoided the Turkish locale problem? Or do we want to just say the service is responsible for, you know, producing equivalence and indexing and using a good collation and things like that? I think that that is clearly the best practice, and it also results in the smallest spec. So we should discourage anyone from modifying names before they pass them to the catalog. The catalog should not modify names before passing to the service, and that is, I think, the clear best practice for this area.
Yeah, I agree on the overall. Just one couple of there are certain things. For example, like if you're doing a create table, there is no opportunity for the client to know that can I pass everything in different casing or uppercasing, because either the server is gonna automatically lowercase it, or it's going to apply a certain casing, or let's say CTAS, where the client has written the data and then trying to make a commit. In those cases, if it knows this is what the catalog support, this is the casing, it accepts all the cases or a certain lowercase, then it can make sure that it will send the request that are aligned to the catalog.
But it shouldn't be modifying anything before it gets to the catalog, because that just requires us to have a way of exchanging that information, which is unnecessary when the client could uppercase something itself. It also, you know, like clients could just do what Christian's talking about and index by upper or lowercase, and also, you know, keep the original casing. I don't think that it is a good practice to either assume or even coordinate what the service's policy is for case sensitivity. We should just pass it through to the service, and the service can make those decisions itself.
Okay. Thanks. So I think like so thanks for all the valuable discussion here. I think the general atmosphere that we will let the service to decide whatever it want to do when it handle the casing received by the request. Yes. So hi, Kevin.
Hey, one thing from this conversation, we talked about a lot about best practices. Is that something we would want to encode somewhere? We have the REST catalog spec page now. Maybe we can put some best practice. Like everything we talked about here is pretty valuable, right? Like the client shouldn't change the casing. Engine should do XYZ. Feel like it's going to come up again.
So I think
might as well leave that somewhere.
I think it would be fine to do that. In this case, in particular, saying that, you know, you should pass through the case that you're passed by the query. I think that that is a good point. I think there's also an argument for just going and opening a PR in Trino and saying like, hey guys, this is the behavior you should default to.
Yeah.
in terms of like the UID v7, this is where you just bake the best practice into the spec. Not that we're reopening this, but that's that is precisely what I'm arguing for. Bake the best practice into the spec.
Yeah.
Same thing here. Like the fact that we don't do any modification of names in the client or in the protocol, or as requirements in the protocol, those are baking best practices into the spec, and you should use those things. So it is probably good to note that the reason why we just pass these things through unmodified is that it is up to the service to make these decisions.
Yeah, I think whatever we can put into the spec that's valuable, we should. And I like the table spec. We have the implementation note, because I know people who are writing new clients, or most people go to the spec for guidance for certain behavior or certain best practice. So it's good to just like encode that. So maybe we'll put it in the REST catalog spec, just like something similar.
But if it can be in the spec, I think it's a practice, it generally should be, unless there's like a strong argument against it in certain cases.
Yeah, I think in this case, like you already have a bunch of clients doing their own thing. So it's just, after the fact, hey, this is the best practice. We can go to the client and open a PR for them to be following the best practice, and new clients should follow the best practice that's here. I think that's
Preno should not be modifying things before it passes them to the catalog, because that's even worse if you have a client configuration to say whether or not to uppercase or lowercase that's independent of the catalog, because then you're trying to force case insensitivity on a case sensitive catalog, and that's ugly.
Yeah, but in general, like if we look at the identifier, like the NC SQL identifiers, it says like if you provided a non-delimited identifier, which is like you did not quote it or added brackets or whatever, the engine is gonna normalize into a case normalized form. It's just that every engine, they don't follow the NC spec. They don't like case normalize to uppercase. They sometimes normalize it to lowercase. So that fragmentation, as well as we do know about catalogs that are also doing it on their end, which I agree ideally should not be the case. But all of this creates this weird thing where some engine does not know what the server is going to do. And engine has its own normalization rules that server might acknowledge or might not acknowledge.
Well, and I think that the ANSI SQL spec here makes this even harder, because it's saying in certain cases, if you don't quote identifiers, then you get the uppercase. But if you do quote identifiers, then we'll respect that, which that's neither case insensitive nor case sensitive, right? It's like if you're not careful, case insensitive.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's a very good discussion, but I would like to see if we can get to another topic in today's meeting. So the next one on the list is a Rust catalog compatibility kit runner.
I wrote to that item on the agenda. Basically, these discussions, then I also had the similar discussions in October 1st meetup for Iceberg meetup. I just want to make the REST compatibility kit is accessible from the end users, then they can test the catalog service provider. I put the PR to get the attention for that. The PR is just shell script and also updating the REST spec page, like how you can test your REST service. I'm not doing any new code. Everything is already, the code base. I am just doing a shell script to make it independent from the build, just getting from the Maven.
Yeah, I love the idea. I don't like shell scripts. Having looked at a bunch of shell scripts in our documentation build, it is really, 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 really hard to maintain. Happy to help.
This one is very simple, by the way. Though it's not like it's not
No,
doing anything else.
Yeah, I get it. It always starts off simple, and then you make a change and everything explodes. I'm happy to help and make this into Python. I feel like even Python is a lot easier to deal with. But generally, love the idea.
Yeah, I am fine. If I just thought shell is more common for this kind of use case, like any machine.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
can I ask about like what it's actually doing here? Because so the script itself is in the repo. So you need the repo for the script. How do you plan on?
No. You don't need the repo for the script. If you look at REST catalog spec line 60, I just put documentation. We will directly pull from the GitHub with curl, and then we will start running and testing.
So wait, so you're pulling from GitHub?
I can share my screen. This
You just pulling the raw file, the raw script from GitHub.
Yeah, exactly. This is the line, the on documentation. That's why I update the documentation side, how you can test the REST catalog implementation. And the curl, it's just pulling from GitHub, like yet another website. Then it's just running that. There is no any dependency on repo. There is no any dependency for compiling or having, all of the repo stuffs.
And then where is the script pulling from for the actual test code?
Maven. It is from Maven. Let's see here. It is, the 1 second. I couldn't find now, but it is from Maven. I can say that. This is the Maven wrapper. In basic, the script is just create a POM file. Then that POM file is just get the Iceberg Open API from Maven. Everything is independent. There is for users just one line code.
The JUnit framework via Gradle from the Maven pull, or like what?
Yes, everything is from Maven pull here. See, it is Maven wrapper and also JUnit also too. JUnit standalone from Maven repo. The script focus is just one line, command line. The user should not do anything else, but it should able to test directly the Polaris or whatever the provider Glue or Hive. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, we had a similar PR on the PyIceberg side where we can expose all of PyIceberg integration tests to an arbitrary res catalog, just for compatibility reasons. The only thing I would add here is that some of the tests are dangerous and can potentially be destructive. So just making sure we call that out explicitly to say if you're running this against a catalog, be warned, it might destroy everything inside.
Yes, I can write on the documentation, but I try to lower the bar as much as possible. Then we discuss like since beginning of this meeting, some coincidence we discussed that between the catalog incompatible to situations, the name related issues, everybody we already have awesome REST compatible ticket. Just we need to lower the bar to users.
Yeah. I do wonder if this belongs here versus somewhere else. And what I mean is we have the reference IRC as a Docker image. Maybe having it somewhere else and as a separate repo.
Sure.
Yeah, not too sure about that one. But yeah, I think generally making the RCK more available and easier to run is a great idea.
Cool. I think we're up to time, but I think that's a very helpful kit. I recommend everyone to discuss more in the PR. And so since we also have like many other topics not covered, so please let us know if you think like we need another cadence in this meeting to discuss, or we need to schedule some separate meeting for that specific topic. But thanks everyone for joining this session. The meeting will be recorded and the recording will be uploaded soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks.